Good morning, everyone. So we are honored this morning to be joined by a friend of Wildwood, Gareth Brandt, who Teresa has already introduced. So Gareth is a freelance artist, an itinerant speaker, and independent scholar who currently lives as a guest on the unceded traditional ancestral homeland of the Matsqui First Nation of the larger Stolo Nation in British Columbia. Gareth is married to Cindy and has 4 children and 1 grandchild. He's worn many hats in his lifetime. Gareth has been a youth pastor, a dean of students, conference youth minister, and has authored several books and many articles. Gareth has been and continues to be informally a teacher of spirituality, spiritual formation, theology, and the history of Anabaptism, which is what brings him here today and this weekend. Gareth is currently on a cross-Canada trip to commemorate the 500th anniversary of Anabaptism with Mennonite churches. And it's a privilege to host him on this tour, and it is, on a personal note, great for both Joe and I to experience this, as we both had Gareth as a teacher in our lifetime. Gareth was one of my professors at Columbia Bible College, and he was a prof of Anabaptist theology class and a later course called Peace and Justice Issues, and is really the first professor to introduce me to the world, the wide and beautiful world of Anabaptism. So part of my journey even to this place of Wildwood. So I'm very grateful to have spent time with him this weekend and to welcome him in this space this morning. And we're looking forward to what you'll share on Pentecost and the coming of the Spirit. So Gareth, thanks for being here, and we look forward to your word.
Thanks, Lizzie. It's an honor for me to be in this congregation. I have experienced Pentecost while I have been here. Acts 2:42 to 47 talks about how the early congregation looked after each other, and I feel like I have been looked after while I have been here since I had my vehicle, which is an e-bike, stolen, and people have contributed to help me to replace that vehicle. I came to serve, and I feel like I have been served, and that is really what the church is about, and so I'm very thankful to be here. Is God speaking today? Perhaps we should ask, we assume by asking, how does God speak, that God does speak. Perhaps we should back up and ask, is God speaking today? Maybe God spoke to Anabaptists 500 years ago, and maybe to Pentecostals just over 100 years ago. But does divinity still communicate with humanity in our sophisticated technical and scientific world ruled by robots and artificial intelligence? How do we hear the voice of divinity today? Or is God speaking just a quaint religious platitude of the elderly and the overly pious? During Peter's Pentecost sermon recorded in Acts chapter 2, he quotes the book of Joel, saying that the events that were happening on that Pentecost festival were a fulfillment of the words of the prophet Joel. And Pentecost has a lot to do with the Hebrew prophets. And so I want to introduce you today to the Hebrew prophet of Joel. My definition of a biblical prophet is one who speaks God's words to God's people in a particular time of need or crisis. And that would apply to Joel and all the others. Prophecy was a sign that God was speaking, or God was present with God's people, that God was working in their midst. And so all the biblical prophets from Isaiah to Malachi spoke during a period before and after the exile, which was the grand calamity or the grand crisis of their time period. When their temple was destroyed, for them, in their culture, that meant God was no longer with them. God had literally left the building. God was silent, and there is nothing so deafening as the silence of God. Thus, the voice of a prophet is needed in a time of crisis. Anabaptism also had its roots in a political and economic crises of the 16th century, when God's voice was also needed. Perhaps we can hear what God says to us in our post-9/11, post-COVID, post-everything crisis, if we tune our ears to the ancient prophet Joel and what they said in a very different time. The book opens with the word of Yahweh that came to Joel, son of Pethuel. The name Joel literally means Yahweh is God. A pretty good name for a prophet. We know nothing about this person's personal life, background, or motivations. Most other prophetic books have a list of kings or something to give them some sort of chronological context. Joel has nothing like that. The only thing we know is that there was a devastating plague of grasshoppers. You probably know about that here in the prairies. I grew up on the prairies, and I remember one year as a teen when grasshoppers cleaned off all the trees and all the crops. More than a mile wide, there was just a strip and many miles long. And if you imagine in an ancient subsistence economy, this could mean starvation and near extinction of a regional population. So it's no wonder then that the plague of locusts is described with such horrific metaphors. Listen to this little poem from chapter 2, verses 6 to 10. At the sight of them, that is the locusts or grasshoppers, nations are in anguish. Every face turns pale. They charge like warriors. They scale walls like soldiers. They all march in line, not swerving from their course. They do not jostle each other. Each marches straight ahead. They plunge through the defenses without breaking ranks. They rush upon the city. They run along the wall. They climb into the houses. Like thieves, they enter through the windows. Before them, the earth shakes and the heavens tremble. The sun and the moon are darkened and the stars no longer shine. Doesn't it just make your skin crawl? This is the context for this wonderful poem named after a person of Joel, whom we know nothing about. Could be an artist that was created as the author. I don't know. But after this spoken word poem describing something that the people all would have known all too well, Joel kind of has everybody's attention. Because the prophets spoke in a time of this need or crisis. They spoke with some emotional intensity. So to keep a bit of a lid on intensity, prophetic books, like all Hebrew poetry, is carefully designed with stock formulas. It's kind of like a good wedding or a good funeral. You need some carefully planned literature, or not literature, that too, but you need some carefully planned liturgy, or the emotions of those events will just get the best of us. And so that's why some carefully planned liturgy. In the same way with prophetic books, they have a carefully planned stock structure, in a sense to give some boundaries to the expression of emotions that could really get out of hand in that time of crisis. One of the formulas for biblical poetry Rather than rhyming lines or rhythmic meter like English poetry, it is what is called parallelism, or a relationship between the lines. And you will have seen that and heard that already in the scripture that was read, where the second line says the same thing as the first, or sometimes the opposite to the first line. Joel not only contains parallelism of all the lines, but also parallelism of stanzas. It's brilliant literary work. You notice the parallelism that both chapter 1, verses 2 to 12, chapter 2, verses 2 to 11 describe the same thing, the plague of locusts. So you have two parallel poems, both describing the same thing. Then the same with the lament, has one in chapter 2, one in chapter 1, on either side there. And then that's the calamity part of the book. Then in part 2, God speaks in the midst of this calamity. And again, you have justice for the oppressed and the oppressor at the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. Then again, words of hope and blessing also appear in parallels. Chapter 2, verses 28 to 32, our text, but another text in chapter 3, verses 13 to 21. So it's brilliantly structured spoken word poem. And thankfully for us, it was also written down for our appreciation. We will look later at some of the parallel lines in the short stanza that was read. But I want to put it in the context of the whole book. I think it's important. I want to focus on the words of hope in chapter 2, verses 28 to 32, that were quoted by Peter at the Pentecost festival. But it is important to see that little fragment as part of the larger message of the book. That small section is part of the divine response to calamity that was described in that first section. And so briefly, how does God respond to calamity? The most obvious and tangible response is with promised blessings of food and wine that the calamity had robbed them of. That seems a logical response. Secondly, God also responds with the judgment of the nations that seem to have been connected to this calamity, to establish social and political justice or rightness and stability. And then right in the middle, and between those two, is that central and what I would say is the most important mark of God's response, and that is where the divine voice speaks loudly and clearly through new and unexpected channels. Remember, the voice of a prophet is needed in a time of crisis, so voices and speaking is very important. In Peter's sermon at Pentecost, he quotes this text and claims that this is what it's all about. As we noted earlier, a prophet speaks God's words to God's people in a time of need or crisis. In a time of need or crisis, you'll want to hear from God. And so it's significant then that Joel mentions some unexpected voices who are speaking God's message. When barriers are removed, God's voice is diversified and amplified. I'd like to look at each of those pairs of lines there. First of all, it is very significant that both sons and daughters would prophesy. Prophesy simply means to speak or to preach. In the past, it had usually been men who would speak God's words. In the age of the Spirit, the barrier of sexuality and gender no longer mattered. As one of my professors once said, no penis is necessary in order to speak God's words. God will speak through one and all. There are some examples of this actually coming true in the book of Acts. If you check out chapter 18, the woman Priscilla, it is significant, is mentioned before her husband Aquila. She is a teacher and mentor to the great preacher Apollos. And then Philip's daughters were mentioned as prophets and preachers in chapter 21. For most of Christian history, unfortunately, it has been men only who speak for God. God's voice, as a result, has been minimized. We are only hearing half of what God wants to say to us. In the 16th century, Anabaptists practiced a surprising equality among the voices of women. If you look at Martyr's Mirror, almost a third of the martyrs were women who also were unafraid to speak up. In 1992, a book was published by Kindred Press entitled "Your Daughters Shall Prophesy," taken from this verse, urging Mennonite brethren churches to study the Bible and open themselves to hear the voices of women. 30 years later, in 2022, another book was published with the voices of those women who had been inspired by that book, with a book entitled "On Holy Ground," stories by and about women in ministry leadership in Mennonite brethren churches. Some of you may be familiar with it. Ironically, this book was initially halted at the presses because one woman included in her story the expansion of voices to include lesbian, gay, and transgender voices also speaking for God. Sometimes the expanding voice of God has been critiqued and feared. And others describe it as a slippery slope. And in the same book, another writer says, "Indeed, it is a slippery slope. Hang on for the ride of your life." And in a sense, that is the message of Pentecost. Hang on for the ride of your life. God is speaking. The second line, or double line, different translations use the lines differently. The dreams of the young. The disseminating of God's voice doesn't end with daughters prophesying. Visions and dreams are also often used to speak special messages to people. It was usually the old and the elderly, saints who had dreams and visions to pass on to the next generation. Now, the young, as well as the old, would have visions from God that would comfort and challenge people. The barrier of age and life experience was no longer relevant in the age of the Spirit. Timothy is a perfect example of this happening in the early church. We see the high regard that Paul had for him with the letters with Timothy's name attached, where Paul says that in one place, "Do not let others look down on you for your youth, but be an example and model in your words and work." And also the 16th century Anabaptist leaders, most of them were young adults. Since I'm an old white man, I think it's safe for me to say that we have monopolized the dreams and visions for the church for too long. And so I challenge us to listen to the dreams of the young. Thirdly, the empowerment of the poor. A third category of marginalized peoples. Even slaves or servants. Again, both male and female are mentioned, would receive the fullness of the Spirit to speak God's messages. Now, slaves and foreigners were often excluded from the community in ancient Israel. And yet the prophet speaks that those on the lowest socioeconomic rung would receive the same Spirit as everyone else. As the powerless are empowered, they will prophesy, preach, speak. And the book of Acts has examples where this happened. A black, African, sexual minority slave, a few different categories, is welcomed into God's family in Acts 8. Onesimus, Philemon's slave, becomes a valuable partner for Paul, so Paul tells Philemon to treat Onesimus as an equal. Again, the Anabaptist movement of the 16th century primarily took off among the peasant classes. And so the book of Joel speaks the outpouring of God's Spirit on all people. God's voice would be heard through unexpected channels. In the new age of the Spirit, God's voice would be diversified and amplified. Good news? Definitely. But there's more. The quoted passage from Joel ends with spectacular signs or symbols in the sky. Although it might refer to actual celestial events such as an eclipse or other fires happening at the time, more than likely verses 30 to 31 are meant to be symbolic rather than literal. Although even in modern days when we understand things like eclipses, after our last eclipse, so many people said it had been a spiritual experience. Most likely, though, as I said, it's symbolic in this case. A symbolic picture of the day of Yahweh, or the day of the Lord, was not a literal day, but a phrase that described God's judgment or God's justice, when all things would be made right. The crops would again grow, and all people would flourish on earth and experience shalom and harmony. Almost all the prophets spoke about this day, including the last prophetic book in the Bible. And it was longed for by people who were experiencing calamity and suffering. The final quote from this little poem is, "And in those days many will call on God and be rescued." And I'm glad the translation that you chose used the word rescued, because we're too familiar with the word saved in religious circles. Salvation has become a bit of a religious cliche, with a formula for how to obtain it and a power structure to monitor it. But it is simply about safety. Safety in all aspects of life, from the spiritual to the material. Isn't that what all people long for? To flourish in safety? This is what salvation means. This also happened in the life of the early church. The outsiders, Paul the persecutor, Lydia the seller of purple, the Ethiopian eunuch, and Cornelius the army general and his entire entourage, all experienced safety or salvation, a safe place of belonging that was open to all. The question is, are these things becoming a reality in the church of today? And you thought this was a one-off Anabaptist 500 sermon, but it really fits with what you are doing in the larger Sundays and in your larger series about the whole body, and including all types of diversity. That is what Pentecost is all about. That is the prophetic meaning behind that particular day. It is about hearing God's voice. Are our churches places where the voices of those on the margins are heard? Are we safe communities? Are churches places of hope in a suffering world? All barriers that separate people from each other in the rest of society are to no longer be barriers in the church. And this includes the barriers of gender, age, and social status. And I think those three lines are meant to be expanded. They're not meant to be exclusive. So we could include family background, race or ethnicity, sexuality, wealth, country of origin, or any other human divider that we can think of. To be a church that lives into the spirit of the prophets, of the prophet Joel specifically, quoted at Pentecost, means that we listen for the voice of God through all people, especially those that we might not expect. Happy listening.